I just want to start off by talking about the various pushback that the animosity China is at the moment showing to various countries, the likes of Australia, as we're seeing there. Then on top of that, of course, we've got the US, India, and pushback with the EU too. The hawks are firmly in charge, it would seem, in China. And from your studies and writings about the internal workings of the Chinese Communist Party, who put the hawks in charge, and are they in charge?
Well, you know, Xi Jinping, I think, is probably a hawk according to the broad classification of the term. So if he's in charge, you know, the hawks are in charge, and he's certainly empowering the hawkish elements of the system. I would slightly qualify that by saying that I think, you know, Xi Jinping really is doing a lot of the things that any Chinese leader would do if they were in charge at this point in time. You know, China's aims have always been consistent, in my view. They want to regain territories which they think are theirs. They want to be the dominant country in the Asia-Pacific at the expense of the US. Hu Jintao could never have done that. China wasn't powerful enough. Xi Jinping's China is powerful enough to do that, and so that's what he's doing.
Also, you know, one would say that one has to ask you whether his position is as secure as it seems, because if you are hawkish and you play the populist or nationalist card, it normally is a cover for somebody weak. What's your view?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about that, and people say, you know, he's not nearly as strong as he looks. He's not nearly as strong a leader, for example, as Deng Xiaoping was. But if you look at China right now, whether it's because he's locked up many of his critics, whether it's because he's cowed many of his critics, and there are a lot of them, we know that, he's unassailable right now. On top of that, after a disastrous start to the COVID-19, China has now done a lot better than many other countries. The Chinese economy, as you were just reporting, recovery is patchy, but nonetheless a much better story than other countries. And there's simply no one or no power centre that can sort of challenge Xi Jinping short of a massive crisis. We might have seen one if COVID-19 wasn't handled, but it's hard to see one right at the moment.
Richard, of course, Donald Trump has called for the total economic decoupling of the United States from the Chinese economy. Now, we've got Xi Jinping's policy. It's been knocking around for a bit. I think you call it old wine in new bottles. Something called a dual circuit, a dual circulation. Is that the same thing as decoupling?
Well, it is in a way. The dual circulation policies, always funny names in English, you know, part of it obviously is boosting consumption, and that's the old wine in new bottles part. You know, Chinese leaders have been talking about the unbalanced growth of the Chinese economy for more than a decade. But the second part, I think, is decoupling, which is domestic security. So instead of the emphasis on global integration, like many other countries around the world, the Chinese are talking about domestic resilience, domestic security. I think the difference in the Chinese case is they really started much earlier. People are talking about, you know, people are criticizing the US for talking about decoupling, but China started much earlier in the internet, for example. So that's what the new policy is about. And I think we're going to see it sort of spelled out in greater detail in the next 5-year economic plan, which will come out early next year.
Richard, it's Juliet here in Singapore, and that plan from China and how China has handled the pandemic, does that give them an advantage to overtake the American economy in real terms sooner than many had anticipated?
It certainly does, and that's the way that COVID in many ways is sort of accelerating historical trends. China was already on track to take over the US economy in real terms by about 2030. I know there are many people who have their own estimates, but that's kind of the World Bank IMF benchmark. According to recent calculations, putting in the new expected growth rates for the US and China post-COVID, China will be the biggest in real terms by 2028. Now, the world doesn't change on that day, but if you accelerate a huge trend like that, it has a big impact, both in terms of real power and, of course, psychologically as well.
I want to get back to the story of Cheng Lei's detention and the fact that 2 other Australian correspondents were rushed out of China by their media organisations. How concerning is this deterioration in the Australia-China relations for other international journalists placed in China, and I guess independent journalism as a whole?
Yes, well, it's certainly concerning for Australia. It's the first time since 1973 that we have not had a single Australian journalist accredited to an Australian organisation inside China. I think that's a bad thing. The Chinese might not care too much, but it certainly worries me. I think generally the US and China have had a big spate over journalists. That's running on its own separate track. But I think the general point to be made is that the Chinese once wanted China foreign journalists in there, then I guess they tolerated them. These days, I think China increasingly doesn't want them or doesn't tolerate them and thinks it doesn't need them. So they're doing the sorts of things that they didn't do much of a few years ago, which is sort of kick them out or drive them out in the case of the Australian journalists.
So this deterioration in relations is quite concerning, and we've touched on a number of other points as well. But when you look at China's view of how it's come out of the pandemic as a whole, you make an interesting point about that Wuhan pool party, which got quite a few hairs up on people's necks in terms of, you know, a lot of people facing lockdown, and then you see something like this. Is this a story of propaganda as well, of China sort of showing how strong its economy is faring?
Yeah, well, for somebody of my vintage, even looking at a photo like that makes me tired. You know, I certainly wouldn't be attending a party that myself, even if I could. But I think the Wuhan pool party was interesting on a number of levels. You know, as you say, when people look at it from outside the country, they have all sorts of different reactions, some of them indignant and angry, like, you know, in other words, we're still dealing with COVID. What on earth are you up to? I think in China, there's a double element to it. Obviously, it's about Wuhan itself, to show to the rest of China that Wuhan is back. But I think generally to show China that China is back, unlike other countries. So it's, you know, most people outside of the country look at these sorts of things and consider them as outsiders. I think you always have to look at the internal dynamic of such news stories in China, because that's the primary motivation, I think.
It's turning into a bit of a tech war, certainly, Richard, at the moment. TikTok, WeChat, ZTE, and, of course, Huawei, all in Donald Trump's crosshairs. Is the future one of a digital Berlin Wall?
Well, it's very hard to see how you construct one, but you could have a little Berlin Wall throughout the system, certainly in a corporate sense. I mean, Mr. Trump might be throwing around all sorts of things before the election. In some ways, between the US and China, I think we're in a kind of hostile holding pattern until we get a result in early November. But I think the US system as a whole, and even some of the US corporates like Facebook, which once really wanted to get into China, are now much more behind the decoupling or Berlin Wall policy than they were before. So that's the general direction of policy. The US has had more success, I think, than people gave them, expected them to have 3-4 months ago with Huawei. So both sides are looking for allies, friends, and partners for their tech story. And if the US and China competition continues, which of course it will, it's hard to see how you turn that around.